Welcome to Future Sense Now, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. An e-zine of the Futures Forum live online. We exchange ideas, information, and inspiration about the futures we want. Get Future Sense Now with host Dr. Claire Nelson, futurist and editor of Human Futures.
And welcome to another episode of Future Sense Now, an online e-magazine of the Futures Forum, and we are live online. It is March 2020 and we're celebrating Women's History Month with an exploration into the future history of women. Now, Women 2030 and beyond, mind you, and why 2030? Well, UN Sustainable Development Goal 5 speaks specifically to the development and inclusion of women, and this year's theme for International Women's Day has been hashtag Each for Equal. Now we want to have a very titillating conversation with our guest for this session. Her name is Maya van Leemput. She is the senior researcher at the Oppenheim Applied Futures Research Center at Erasmus University College in Brussels, Belgium. And she's also a director of her own private practice called Agence Futures. Mm-hmm. Let me just add one of the reasons why we're having this conversation, because she most recently published an article which has intrigued people by the title in the Journal of Future Studies, and the title is Destinations for Polyamorous Futures and Their Mad Lovers. So without further ado, let us go right into a conversation with my new friend Maya van Leemput. How are you, Miss Maya?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me and spend some time and have some fun as we celebrate Women's History Month. So let me just first start off with the serious stuff about, Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals 5 that says we're going to end poverty, hunger, combat inequalities within and among countries with peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, promote gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. As you think about 2030 and what you see emerging and the work that you're doing, the research you're doing, and the teaching you're doing at this university, how are you seeing the issue of girls and women emerging and heading in terms of the year 2030?
Well, in my classes, there are, of course, plenty of young women. And I tell them, when I tell them about how slowly things actually change in our social environments, I tell them about how my grandmother used to be one of the first women in her generation to go out to work. She worked at a telephone switchboard, she knew her languages, and she was a working woman, and this was really exceptional at the time. Mm-hmm. And it was difficult for her as well. It was a challenging thing to do. And then my mom became an interpreter and worked all her life, as well, as while I was there. And she still had guilt, about being a working mother. And it wasn't all that easy for her either. It wasn't as hard as it had been for my grandmother. Mm-hmm. And so now the third generation is me. And for me, it's normal, and I don't worry, I don't have any guilt over working or even over being ambitious or something like that. And when I tell that story to the girls and the young women in my classes, I ask them if they think that we're at a stopping point now or not. Mm-hmm. And because, it's been so slow, it's taken 3 generations, are we there yet?
Yes.
And they don't seem to think we're there yet. They know about income gap. They also know how much harder it is, especially as a young woman, to be taken seriously, which is, an effect that a lot of them have, because just the fact of smiling can be a problem for you and things like that. Yeah. So then on the other hand, I also think about the young women who are really, really focused on gender that I met in Lubumbashi in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is an old Belgian colony, used to be. And the women there, the young women there are much more, are working much more at it. Because our girls, they here in Belgium, they testify that they know that there's still work, but they're not actually really actively engaged in it. And I know, and I think that that's a different thing. I mean, for themselves, yes, they're independent and they try to, you know, do their thing, but they're not, I don't meet a lot of feminist activists among my students here in Brussels.
It's interesting. So the students that are in your class, is your class an optional class? So you're teaching futures, right? Is it an optional class or is it a required class, first of all?
It's a required class for third-year bachelor idea and innovation managers. Professional bachelor course.
So actually, so your course is seen as a requirement for people who are in the design kind of thinking kind of world.
In innovation, yes.
Innovation, design thinking. Okay, so in that space, are you meeting, say, students, men or women, who are even using these 2030 goals to have a conversation about this creation of a more equal future? Do these come up in classes between the male students and the female students? Are you having these conversations with both sides?
Yes, of course. Yes, and sometimes, depending on which group, you know, it's always just individual people who are more strongly engaged in this theme or this topic than others. And I would say both among the young men and the young women, both.
Yeah. So tell me, you have also this private practice, Agence Futures. Tell me about what that is doing to advance a futures literacy, if you will, among people, and to what extent are you looking at the issue of a gendered reality?
So with Agence Future, my partner and I, so it's already a you know, a two-person undertaking with a guy and a girl. With Agence Future, we interview people about their ideas about the future, and we try to help these people figure out how you could put their ideas and their concepts into images, and how you can actually make it visual and tangible, and how you where do you see the future today, and what is it? And so through the conversations with our participants, I think we do work at their futures literacy and at our own, because every conversation you have about the future is one that makes you more futures literate. And then we also produce video documents or exhibits that are based on that work, with the photos that, you know, try to visualize and imagine, or with video recordings of the interviews. We put up these installations, or we show them online, and so in that sense people can join in and hear what people talk about.
So how many people do you say you have interviewed in the last 6 months?
In the last 6 months? That's a hard one. That's not so many, I believe. I have no idea. Not even 10. Not even 10. But in the last 20 years, I've interviewed 1,000.
Wow.
I'm around 1,000 now.
That's a lot. So you basically have a database of 1,000 views of the future. This is really information worth mining, because conversations with that many people give you a really strong view of the diverse images. But in that case, are you seeing any clusters of similarity?
Well, so
yeah.
So thank you for that question. It's really interesting. So our first set of 382 interviews Some of them recorded in notes, others in audio, and others in video, not all recorded in the same way, were held when just as my first postdoctoral research project. I'd done a doctorate about how the future is represented on television. And I wanted to look at how it's actually represented in people's hearts and minds. And we set up this project where we traveled 5 continents, and we tried to have a really diverse group of conversation partners. We had both experts and lay people, and we had like really open-ended orientation conversations, and then we had a semi-structured interview schedule that we followed for about 100 of the conversations. And so this this collection was really, really varied, and it would have been wrong to pretend that it was representative of any kind of grouping of people. I mean, you've interviewed 382 people in 28 countries. There's nothing you can generalize, right? But there is individual ways of speaking about the future. There are perspectives, there are feelings, there are all these different unique approaches to the future that each of the people that we ever spoke with actually has. And so we try to respect that. And then a professor suggested that I should, if I wanted to analyze, that I shouldn't analyze where it came from, but how one position combines with another. So for example, if somebody in their interview suggests that they don't feel comfortable with uncertainty, then do they also answer other questions in the same way as somebody else who says that they're not comfortable with uncertainty? And so there's a subject position is the way that I've gone about the analysis. I'm not dividing people up into groups of where they're from, and gender, obviously, it's always noted, and that's like already half-half, and now with 1,000, you're beginning to become tempted, but still, because all the interviews are so different, it's very hard to say, you know, men this and women that. I don't believe that anyway.
I would really love to see out of this exercise a real easy to gather or grasp or follow, I guess I say exhibit or book or some kind of online platform that really allows us to sort of, because you have done all these countries and all these interviews, it's really a very powerful exercise that you have been engaged in. And you plan to do it more of it, or have you finished?
Yeah, so we did this first 380 about 20 years ago, right? In one project, we were traveling with 2 recumbent bicycles, and it was all really exciting, and you know, and then we came back and we started to set up projects that would allow us to continue to conduct interviews, you know, wherever our projects took us, and without it being so dedicated to keep on doing it. And so that for sure we want to, but also we want to conduct more interviews while we show what we've got from before to people, because that turn in the ethnographic work where you're collecting things and you're building these images also together with the people that you're talking with. And then you want to actually, it's a real urge that you want to go back and show it to the same people. Like, look, and we did it elsewhere as well. And look what we have. And now what do you say? And so we would like to continue, yes.
So in any of your conversations, have any of them discussed their concerns, fears, optimism about gender itself, about the lives of women in the future, or how life might be different for women in the future? Has that come up at all, or people, unless prompted, don't go there? I'm just curious, as if you don't prompt people, like, you know, if I don't give you a prompt, are you going to naturally start talking about, and you're a woman, for example, or a man, are you naturally going to start talking about a gendered perspective of the future?
Yeah.
Versus if I prompt you, have you any memory about how that evolved in the process of your research?
Yes. So what we find is that people talk about the subjects that are going on around them in their present day, even if you ask them to talk about the next 20 years or so.
Yeah.
What the topics that they are inspired by what's going on today. And so in places where gender topics had been treated like around a particular group, civil grouping that we people we met in Lubumbashi, there was a lot of talking about gender without prompting, both from the young men and the young women. But then in other contexts, if there was tree planting going on, then maybe tree planting would be the thing that came up first, right? So it also depends on the topic that's on in the present for people. At the same time, I think that a lot of women, when they spoke, even if they emphasized that they spoke as a woman. Right? I've actually in India, very scary. I had a lady who said, I'm sorry, I'm just newly married. You need to ask your questions to my husband.
Wow.
So that's not really the hopeful input that you might have been looking for. But of course, there's the same thing. There's this like, yeah, I know it's tough for a girl, but I'm going to do it anyway type of projections for personal futures. And for local futures, it's very clear that people are very much aware that mothers and aunties and sisters everywhere in the world make a really big difference to local contexts at the smaller scales. And so that gets emphasized in quite a lot of the conversations. And then when you go to experts, obviously, some experts have this interest and then they will put it forward. And if they don't, they don't.
Well, it's fascinating that, as you said, that only on a few occasions do people think about gender and the future unless they are prompted. And that's important because it means that at a certain kind of subtext level, what our daily lives are concerned with is more like the regular things. How are we going to eat? How are we going to find water? Are we going to get energy? Are we going to get housing? And hopefully, it means that at some level, people don't get up thinking about there's something wrong with gender relationships. I mean, they might know it's down there, but it's not the foremost thing on our head, which is a good thing. I think it keeps us from probably being at war every day with the people who we love, right? So it's a good coping mechanism. This article you wrote, it really has my mind, sort of boggled. Destinations for polyamorous futures. Tell me about that, if it has anything to do with what I am thinking. So tell me about this.
It's of course, it's a metaphor, and it's a metaphor for interdisciplinarity, but interdisciplinarity that goes a bit further than just, yes, of course, I'm doing a project on the futures of transport, so I'm involving a transport specialist. This makes it interdisciplinary. There's also the types of practice and the fields of practice that, for example, of designers and artists and media professionals there in collaboration with futurists. They are not, so the polyamorous label was used to refer to the fact that we combine with so many other professions and so many other disciplines if we do our work well.
Oh no. And here's as I was thinking, okay, they're going to be talking about the fact that, it be like.
But of course, it is a slightly autoethnographic text in the sense that I do work together with a media arts and design professional who is also my partner.
Okay.
And so he's, my mad lover. Okay. And we have this practice, this Agence Futurist practice that we were talking about before. This is something we started up together with the help of a group of friends and then a bigger network of connected groups and individuals. But this practice, of course, is my life partner as well as my work partner in this project. And the whole article was all about how you actually collaborate if you're a futurist and you want to involve these media, arts and design perspectives and methods and goals, destinations,
Yeah,
you know, then how to do that and what to do and what not to do, what to
But you
remember.
know, it's interesting because for me, I'm an engineer and I'm a systems thinker. That's my natural place.
Right.
So I have never thought about not doing a futures exercise that doesn't involve everybody. In the sense that if we're trying to look at a picture of the future of, say, water, right, or energy,
Yes.
and for me, that the provision of water for all is actually a systems of systems challenge. So
Yes.
any real serious attempt to look at how are we going to ensure that we really make water accessible 20 years from now, given what's happening with climate change, given what the prognosis is for rivers and snow and all of these things, does require us to have the geologists, the hydrologists, the meteorologists, the engineers, the economists working together. So I guess for me, I don't see it as something like outside of the norm, which is again interesting because one's norm is somebody's exception. You know, what is one person's norm is someone's exception. As
But
a futurist,
interdisciplinarity in futures is not the exception. That's the rule. The thing is that there's a particular depth and it's interdisciplinarity times interdisciplinarity. Because when you said that you do futures with everybody, so that means all these professions that you just summed up, the geologists, the engineers, the mathematicians, the climatologists, everybody, but also the, you know, an auntie and an uncle and a grandmother and young people and artists and storytellers and ways to actually have those conversations with everybody. They are really hard to have, to be really inclusive, you know, with those scientific professions that you just summed up.
That's true, because most places, most countries, I think, have devalued. And unfortunately, as a development practitioner, I find that the international development world has devalued other ways of knowing. So to a large extent, they focus on intellectual knowing. And so I think it's only now, since we have hit the climate crisis, that people are scrambling to say, well, maybe we should go back and talk to some ancient wise people in the bush and get a sense of what happened here 100 years ago. So we gotta know how to go forward. We have to be able to walk around, yes, looking forward, but with some kind of rear view mirror as to what are some ways of knowing that we might want to recapture in order to better design what we want. And as I think about the work that you're doing at a university, Erasmus University College, I'm wondering if in your course, have you explored issues around new metrics? Have you talked about, if you're talking about designing a better future, have you in any of your workshops or if any students talk about their discomfort with the metrics, say for example, of GNP or GDP? Has that come up in any of your workshops with the young people you're working with?
It's I guess that depends on what their so some of them actually attach great importance to GDP and are all about learning how to make it the largest possible for a particular nation, right? And others others are more critical and understand that and think about the way the world's been organized and whether it could be done differently. And then obviously there's always a few students every year that bring the Bhutan example of gross national happiness as an example in their work, or so but that's like a certain proportion of students, like it's a certain proportion of people who have different positions.
Right, you are not seeing like a millennial trend in the sense that you don't, it's feeling there's a trend to this sort of a common good metric for Europe, for example. Europe needs to have a well-being indicator so that the tension between, let's say, the haves of Germany and the have-nots of Portugal or the have-nots of Turkey or wherever are not so pronounced, and we focus more on well-being that helps us to have this cross-cultural and cross-economic conversation. So you're not really hearing that from your design students.
My students are really heterogeneous. I wouldn't sort of, but maybe that's because I'm looking too close and I'm seeing 50 individuals every year. And but to me they look really heterogeneous, and when we put them in through a Polar game, you know, is the questions is, are things getting better, are they not, and do you and the question of agency, you know, what's your impact on this, and or do you not have that? We get students in all 4 quadrants. We get people who think things are getting better. We have people who think things are getting worse. And we have people who think like, yeah, nothing I can do, or not enough anyway. And then there's others who go like, imagine we of course we have to do something. And
so in other words, the human norm has remained the human norm. The quadrants are still those quadrants. You have the 4 types of people, and that's fascinating, because I think that might be instructive as a futurist in like, how do we then, if we're trying to make change happen, if we're trying to engender gender equality, and we have the same kind of traditional mindsets, even though we've come 30 years forward from where we were, then it is still going to be that same quadrant that says we have to do something, on which the levers of change will have to be pulled. And they're the ones that are most likely to go out and do it. So thinking about that, what keeps you up at night in terms of your worry? Like, you know, I'm teaching these kids. I have this job and I like it because I feel like I'm doing something to bring about futures literacy in the next group of people who are designing things for the future. Does anything about that keep you up at night that says, oh, but I wonder if I'm really... What worries you?
But in relation to my students, specifically,
or anything,
well,
or anything about the way in which we're going about thinking and shaping the future we want.
Well, I think it's I would have said a few years ago, I would have definitely, without a doubt, immediately said apathy. That's what bothers me. You know, if there's something that keeps me up, it's apathy.
Yeah.
Now, more recently, I've started to be engaged with a group in Brussels who are called Brussels Avenir, and they are trying to tell stories about the next 10 years. They have the 2030 time horizon. About the next 20 years, actually, and also 2 women taking the initiative and running the show there. They tell stories about 2030 and with people in Brussels and for people in Brussels, so as to activate them, right? As a sort of a way to find a response to this apathy. And I found myself saying like, yeah, but does everybody have to be activated? Isn't there also a way where the people who have that in them should just be protecting the people who don't, and let some people just go about their daily business without having to worry about the future of my city and how it's, you know, to just be in daily life? Maybe there's something that at a certain point we get so involved in this changing things and trying to do the right thing for the way the world is going, and that we become really demanding of our fellow human beings. And I don't know whether that's always right, actually. So maybe that's what's keeping me up right now, to think about that, to process it.
That's a very interesting idea, to think about what is our responsibility as individuals. Thinking about this idea of each for equal as the hashtag. It means that we're saying that each of us has to do our part. And your question is, but what does our part mean? Maybe our part is just not being in the way. Doesn't mean our part is to go out and try and shake the bushes for you. And that's the question, because I think sometimes on an interpersonal level, we women sort of get impatient with the women who are not out there trying to be a gender activist. Like I do not see myself as a gender activist. And so my friends who are gender activists kind of get annoyed with me because I'm like, but why do I have to be a gender activist? I'm doing other things, you know? So they think I should be feminist. And I said, but I'm not a feminist. I don't believe some of the things. So we have long arguments about it. But I still believe that I'm contributing to the notion that equality of opportunity and equality of access and equal pay for equal work, I totally believe in those things. But do I have to do it on the label of being a feminist? And I think that's certainly a question that, you know, you are asking yourself. I think it's a good question to ask. Maybe we won't answer it in this conversation, but it's good to ask. Would you say you're optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic? That 2030, your friends are doing this conversation about 2030. That's fantastic, because that's really what I'm focused on. How are we going to get to a better place in 2030? Are you optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic that the efforts you are making with your students, that your friends are making with these conversation circles, that's going to help us get to a better place?
Well, I'm not going to make statements about the way history is going to go, but I do believe that we are contributing for the better to the present and to the future. It's I don't know whether will all end well. Actually, I'm not particularly inclined to feel that way, even though I might rationalize the possibilities for getting there. You know, I can see how things could be better, or certain ways we might try, or things that are worth putting our efforts into and all that. But at the same time, I don't need to be an optimist to feel that you need to feel that it's right that we do these things.
So you want to say perhaps you're neutralistic?
No, because I feel it's really important that we don't go one thing good and the other thing bad, and so I'm an optimist, or I'm a pessimist, or I'm in the middle, and then I'm neutral. I'm not neutral. I believe some stuff really stinks in the world. I don't know, I'm not neutral. I have strong opinions.
So you're not optimistic, you're not pessimistic, you're not neutralistic. So I'm going to come with a new, because I like my little label. My new label for you is you are mixtimistic.
For example, I think some people would say maybe it's mutative, because there was this book called Mutative Media by Jim Dater and John Sweeney Aubrey, and then they talk about technology optimism and pessimism or neutrality, and then no, it's not none of that, none of the above. Actually, things mutate together, and
you're mutatistic.
Yeah.
So we are evolving, and so because we're evolving, you are not in any one position at any one time. You're a true quark. You're always in a state of motion, so you're a quark.
Yes, and also
you're in a quantum state. You're a quantum state.
And also, I know very well that some of the things I would consider wonderful and that I could be optimistic about are dreadful idea for others. You know?
It's all relative. Therefore, I think we have to come up with a new way of expressing this understanding of materiality and of the realism. And we're going to start working on it. We won't have it today, but we'll have it. It will deal with the issue of how do we brand this state of quantum being, where at any moment we can either be on, off, it's in us, we're a wave at sometimes, we're particle at some point, and we're a burst of light sometimes. So this is good. So one final question, Miss Maya. If you're working with these young people, you're doing your project, you have now done over 1,000. So I want you to jump into 2030, right? And I want you to see yourself in this fantastic exhibit. I want you to tell me how many people and how successful is the story about this project you have done in Agence Future. What is that? What is happening at this event?
Well, it's a huge polylog, and it's the biggest future fair that there's been for ever. since a few years we're doing future fairs in 2030, we've understood that we need to go to physical places, combine it with digital as well, and put up as many futures as we possibly can, and pay attention, and make it easy to pay attention. So there's this future fair, and this is the exhibit you're talking about, I think. And then I'll be there, and I will be helping out with the polylogue, where we try to have not a dialogue or a monologue, but a polylogue. This is also, the word poly is dear to me, apparently.
So I see.
So this is a conversation where you have scientists and experts and professionals of all kinds, and people who are, professionals and experts in very different topics, or who have people of all walks of life, is what we say, I think, normally, that they can have conversations about all these different future possibilities that are being presented at this fair. And that they can have them with each other as equals, which speaks to your tag as well.
So how many people do you have interviewed by then?
In another 10 years? Well, let's say that I'll do another 1,000. So I'll do double I did 1,000 in 20 years. So now I'll do 1,000 in another 10.
So we have 2,000 interviews. And some of them, how have you combined them using virtual reality or augmented reality?
So I made this installation, and now in 2017, I made an installation which has 17 screens, and you could hear people talking from one screen to the other over the course of an hour, all things that people say about the future. And so this one actually has you walk through everywhere, and then you find this hologram or this augmented reality feature that gives you quotes from the things people have said over time.
Well, on that note, I will have to say that I'm so excited to be at the 2030 Futures Fair in Brussels, being put on by Agence Futures. And
we're just contributing.
But I thought you were...
Because we don't do things alone, right? We do it together with everybody. You will be organizing it together with us.
Being put on in partnership with Agence Futures. And over 100,000 people have come so far to this 10-day festival. Wow. And it's just a real zoo of filmmakers and artists, and this wonderful exhibit which goes back 30 years, looking at where we were in 1990 and looking at where in the year 2010, year 2000, and look at where we are 30 years into the future. And more importantly, we have in one space of the exhibit a room that has the people who come are now being asked to leave their story for 2060. Isn't that fantastic? So I'm so delighted to be there with you, Maya Van Leemput.
Thank you for that image.
Thank you for joining us. Maya Van Leemput is a senior researcher at the Oppenheim Applied Futures Research Center at Erasmus University College, and she's also director of Agence Futures, which has been doing work in interviewing and curating people's views on the future there in Europe. So folks, that's it. We have come to the end of another delightful conversation, and we want to thank you for joining us on Future Sense Now, where we explore salient ideas for sustainable futures. Remember that although this conversation has ended, the story continues being written by all of us. Creating the future we want is our shared responsibility, and it is better for us to act as the parent of our future than the child of our past. So, as we say in Jamaica, walk good and safe journeys.
Safe journeys.
Thank you for listening to Future Sense Now with Dr. Claire Nelson. Future Sense Now is produced by the Futures Forum in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Remember, our futures are embedded in the landscape of our present stories. Seize the day, share this story, and share the future.